Don't tell me you've ever made a dumpling unless you've sat at a table with 3 generations of Asian women in front of a big bowl of dumpling mix, sharing tales and stories of the past and present. Chances are you've probably never had a proper dumpling. Wontons are simply dumplings in a square wrapper, but they also happen to be the most ubiquitous and the probably most poorly represented item on a Chinese American restaurant menu. When they're done properly with love and care, they're nice and succulent when you bite into them. A burst of juice comes out from the perfect balance of fat. And they're not too small, and they are not too big so that when you cook them, they don't break in the soup. My mother's recipe was very simple: ground pork, shrimp, soy sauce, sesame oil, ginger, scallion, cabbage or spinach. She never wrote her recipe down, but she could just tell from looking at the mix what the rest of the ingredients would be and how much she needed, by the texture of the meat, the color of the meat. They were perfect. She would take a big bowl of water and she would drop them in gently, and as they were rising to the top, they would be perfectly made. And then she would gently scoop them out and put them into a bowl, just simply with a little bit of sesame oil, soy, ginger, and scallion. As a child, I didn't fully appreciate the full recipe. It was truly a recipe of comfort of my childhood, but I didn't understand all that went into it: the heritage, the culture, the storytelling. And so as I grew up, I tried to push my mother's recipe away at times. When I was at school, I just wanted to belong, and belonging meant assimilating, being more like others. And that meant for me eating at McDonald's, because we would order everything plain because we didn't eat cheese or mayonnaise, or dressing like everybody else and wanting to have that pair of Levi's because that was the brand that everybody wanted. As a 12-year-old, belonging to me meant having a version of myself that others would accept. As I was growing up, I knew that we were outsiders. We were only a handful of Asians in a predominantly white community. But that wasn't enough. Kids at that time didn't know any better, and they would make fun of us and make jokes. So naturally, as I grew older, I wanted the freedom and independence to grow and be away from my family, so I got a job at our local French restaurant, the Fromagerie, around the corner from our house. The fromage, as we fondly called it, made quiche, fettuccine alfredo, fondue, all things that were very foreign to us. It wasn't the tastes or the smells that attracted me to the job. I loved service. I fell in love with the Fromagerie. It became a second home to me. It didn't matter who you were. You would be accepted no matter what, regardless of what you did. As long as you were for the team and you worked really hard, you would be accepted. Before the shift started, we would share our daily lives in front of the family meal, and at the end of the shift, we would go out for beers and burgers and relive all those classic moments that restaurants are known for. I was loving it and dreaming even more about what it would be like to own my own restaurant. When I came to Penn, I chose Wharton because I figured a business degree, who doesn't want that if they're going to open their own restaurant one day? And plus, it was only 2 hours away from home, so I could escape at any time and go back home and work at the Fromagerie. But when I got to Penn, I didn't lean into any community. There were tons of Asians, and I didn't lean into that community. Maybe I was scared or afraid of rejection. But that isolation left me longing and feeling the same feeling that I felt when I was in high school of not belonging. And so I craved the fromagerie and of returning home. But when I did, things had changed at the fromagerie. Maybe some of my friends had gone off to school. Some of them had changed jobs. Or maybe it was me that had changed. If belonging was a place, maybe I had found it. I came back to Penn, and I thought to myself, all I need is another restaurant. If I find that other restaurant, I'll find that place to belong. I got a job at the fromagerie, I got a job at La Terrasse, right around the corner from the Penn Law School, and fortunately, those same feelings of acceptance and connection were the same ones that I felt when I was working at the fromagerie. The relationships I built there lasted decades. And I was even more passionate about the hospitality industry. I even wrote a business plan for a restaurant. But unfortunately, that project told me that I was not going to be opening a restaurant any day soon. Belonging maybe was a job. And so I realized I needed plan B. I had to have a backup plan, and Wharton at that time was predominantly management consulting and investment banking, and I knew that wasn't going to be for me. I needed something more entrepreneurial. So if belonging was a job, I had to find it. I knew how I felt when I worked at the restaurant, the feelings of completion, of success, of excelling in my job, and I knew those were the feelings that I needed to find in my next job. Ultimately, I found a more entrepreneurial job, but it only lasted 9 months. Finding an entrepreneurial job isn't that easy when you're 23 years old. And the next 3 didn't work either. Frustrated by the fact that I hadn't found my dream job, I decided to apply to graduate school. And although Wharton hadn't changed that much, and those mainstream jobs were still the norm, the last time I was at Penn, I had not taken advantage of all those things, and I thought to myself, I need to try my hardest to overcome my natural shyness, yes, natural shyness, and really join the community. Ultimately, I ended up getting a job when I graduated as a management consultant, but I still had that passion for the restaurant industry. Maybe belonging was finding a career. Fortunately, I met my future business partner when I was in grad school. I picked up a copy of Food and Wine magazine one day, and I looked at it, and all the chefs and restaurateurs that were being featured were in their 20s and 30s. I was 31 years old, and I thought to myself, if they can do it, why can't I? Later that year, we opened our first restaurant, Fork, our flagship restaurant, which is now turning 25 years old. 1997 quickly became 2020. We were growing, maturing, expanding. We opened next door to the building next to us, Fork, etc., a prepared foods cafe and bakery. We took over operating a kitchen and bar in Rittenhouse Square. We opened outposts of our high street concept, which we took over Fork, etc., in New York and West Philadelphia. I was feeling really comfortable as a restaurateur, capable and confident. But then the pandemic happened. What we thought was only going to be 2 years turned out to be, what we thought was only going to be 2 weeks turned out to be 2 years. I was devastated. I felt like my life was coming to an end. I didn't know where to go. I was lost. I just kept telling myself, keep going. All you'd have to do is make it to the next day, and the day after, and the day after. Our artisanal bread started selling. High Street turned to all takeout. Soup, salads, pizzas, pastas, sandwiches, all became our mainstay. We fed 10,000 frontline worker meals unemployed hospitality workers, as well as the food insecure. The pandemic didn't just change what we were doing conceptually. The problems that plagued our industry during this period of trying to survive, the razor-thin margins, low cash reserves, poor wages, abuse of power, all became exposed during the pandemic. What happened to this industry that I was so passionate about over 24 years? It had hit complete rock bottom. But when things hit the bottom, there's only one way to go, and that's up. And it provided an opportunity to reevaluate, to reset, to grow, to innovate, to figure out how to do things better, and to make things better for those less fortunate than ourselves. As we all know, the pandemic was much more than a public health crisis. The social issues were mounting. Injustice, inequity, violence, all were things that were popping up in the news. Anti-Asian discrimination and hate became a news item. I didn't know what to do. I never thought about that myself, and sure, I'd been called names before, but violence had never even crossed my mind. I felt I couldn't just do nothing. Confronted with the fact that I had done everything I could to provide an environment of belonging for my employees, the support, mentorship, opportunities for growth, leadership, I still hadn't done it. One night, I was awoken in the middle of the night by an angry text from one of my former employees, a young Asian American woman, who texted angrily, "When are you going to do something, speak out against racism and discrimination in the restaurant industry?" I can protest all day, I can scream on my social media and still be less impactful than you. I couldn't sleep that night. I've only owned non-Asian restaurants my entire life. And I also only barely read and write Chinese. If I became a spokesperson for AAPI hate, would the Asian community think of me as an imposter? What could I do to change the situation? What could I do to make an effect? These questions prevented me from following my own recipe all these years. I thought to myself, the uncertainty and fear had stifled me. I asked myself, who was I to work in a French restaurant? Who was I to not join Asian clubs? Who was I to buck the traditional wonton job search? Who was I to be a spokesperson for AAPI hate? Wait a minute, who am I? Ellen Yin, restaurateur, wonton chef extraordinaire, Asian American woman. Yes, I actually had the answer, the recipe for comfort all along. You guessed it, wontons. Wontons were my personal comfort food as a child growing up, and they could be for anybody else too. And I could actually share it knowing that I was honoring myself and being authentic. So the Wonton Project was born. The Wonton Project is very simple. Enjoy wontons, raise awareness against anti-Asian discrimination, raise money for nonprofits who are building community and fighting Asian discrimination. The Wonton Project raised funds for organizations like Asian Americans United, right here in Philadelphia, who raise awareness about cultural heritage, fight for immigrant rights, fight against educational injustice. Belonging is something that isn't a job. It's not a place. It's not something that others can find for you. Belonging is part of a journey that you find about yourself, that you take the most uncomfortable parts of yourself and grapple with them and find that recipe that defines yourself. You'll look down one day after you've grappled with all these things and know that your recipe for belonging is only one ingredient away. Thank you for listening.